Hey nerds, what's up? So I've literally been interested in reading Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Phillip K Dick since I was in high school, based mostly just on the title because it sounded interesting. But like ships passing in the night, for literal decades this sat on my I eventually want to read list and I never got around to it. I've also just never seen the movie Bladerunner, so I decided it was time to fix this gap in my pop culture knowledge, and so over the course of a single week, I read the book and watched both Bladerunner installments, Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049. The concept of artificial intelligence in science fiction is a topic that has been around forever and is just something we will likely continue talking about forever. There have been so many evolving flavors of AI over the years, from AI being rebellious and something to be feared, to something neutral, to perhaps something beloved and kind. Often the first novel credited with the ideas of artificial intelligence is the infamous Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, published all the way back in 1818. Although Samuel Butler's novel Erewhon, published decades later in 1872, is widely considered the first novel dealing with machines with human intelligence. These stories were written long before our current concept of AI was even a reality. This is truly something humanity has been wrestling with for centuries. At their heart, these stories deal with humanity. What is it to be human? Which is perhaps why it is such a pervasive thing. Like many fantasy and sci-fi stories, we make the intangible touchable in order to explore it more fully. As AI continues to become a greater part of our life, these stories will naturally change. We may not have reached a full human specimen like in many of these AI stories, but we have named our AI. Hey Siri. And we are getting concerned with AI in new ways. In conjunction with the video I just created about how adaptations may change in the time period they were created in, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep offers a super interesting opportunity to view AI over time, as the original book was written in 1968, the first adaptation, Blade Runner, released in 1982, and the follow-up sequel to that movie in 2017. So experiencing these three in a week in 2024, 55-ish years after the book was published, today we will be talking about each of the pieces of media individually and what I thought about them. We'll be talking about their thematic elements in dealing with AI, and then we'll also be comparing and contrasting them and what different things they might say about AI based on when they were created. And of course, I'll also give like my ranking of which piece of media I liked best. We'll be talking about all of that after the jump. Let's start with the original media, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Phillip K Dick. Can we talk about what an evocative title that is? I love it. It is a little inconvenient because it is so long, but it has a lot of implications within the story as well, and I think that's literally the only reason I wanted to read it in high school was just the title. I'm guessing most of you watching this video that it's more likely you have watched Blade Runner rather than reading the novel, so I did want to do a very quick summary of some important elements that are found in the novel so we can better discuss and compare and contrast. So if you have read the book, you can use my chapters down below to skip over this quick summary, but otherwise I'm just gonna give you a little one. So starting out, we learn that Earth has gone through something called World War Terminus, which has left the Earth full of radiation and killed most animal life. A majority of people have immigrated to other planets, but some few humans have stayed behind, either because they want to or because they are not allowed to immigrate because they are specials. Specials are not allowed to immigrate because they are damaged by the radiation or have failed an IQ test. Android servants have been provided to everyone if they agree to immigrate as an incentive to do so. However, despite advertising suggesting that space colony life is great, it's actually pretty bleak, and the androids, or as they are called, replicants, are unhappy with their role as servants. Many escape and go rogue on Earth and must be hunted down. Animals are seen as a status symbol, and it's almost seen as suspicious if you do not have one. Those who cannot afford real animals often get fake animals that are incredibly lifelike. One of the reasons for this is that replicants don't have empathy, so showing care of an animal shows that you have empathy. One other piece of world building is the idea of a mystical figure named Mercer. Through something called an empathy box, people share in each other's burdens and emotions by sharing Mercer's physical body and experiencing what he experiences. Happy individuals who use the empathy box leave sadder, having shared their happiness, and vice versa. This practice is called Mercerism. The novel follows Rick Deckard, a bounty hunter who is tasked with hunting down 5 rogue replicants and kill them or retire them. In order to do this, it is required by law that he give each replicant an empathy test to prove that they are a replicant. Deckard is extremely excited about the money he could get tracking down these new Nexus 6 models. He can finally buy a real animal, since his secret is that he has been caring for a fake sheep after his real one has died. Before he hunts these replicants, he visits the creators of the replicants, the Rosencorp. Here he does meet Rachel. However, in the novel, she is presented as real, and it's a trick to try to invalidate their empathy test. If the empathy test says she's an android, but she's really a human, then they can't use that test anymore. However, Deckard does end up seeing through this ruse and realizes she is actually a replicant. Rachel knows the entire time that she is a replicant and even offers to help Deckard track down the others. Deckard eventually hunts down all the replicants, although they use increasingly sophisticated means to elude him. After retiring 3 replicants, Deckard is able to buy a real goat. Then, Rachel seduces Deckard in an attempt to make him stop wanting to hunt the others. She has used this tactic in the past with other Bladerunners, and it has always worked. Deckard ends up going through with it anyway. When he's finished retiring the last replicant, he returns home to discover Rachel has killed his goat in revenge. Upset, Deckard flies far away and has an intense experience with Mercer. Despite the fact toads are supposedly extinct, he finds one hopping in the desert and takes it home to his wife. Exhausted, Deckard falls asleep. His wife discovers that the toad is actually an electric replicant. Sorry, I know that was a little long, but I think it's really important that you kind of see those differences as a baseline for discussing the Blade Runner movies in conjunction with the book. So when I initially rated this book, I gave it a 3.5, but even in my review, I said I felt it was likely that my review was going to change because I could tell it was one of those books that might stick with me and I would feel more favorable to it with some distance. That is true. That happened. I think I'd give it a 4 now. My thing with Do Androids Dream is I think some of the execution was lacking. Sometimes the story got a little unwieldy for how short it was, and there was just like a lot of elements. But ultimately, the ideas presented in this novel are so evocative. The ideas presented are just so interesting, and I can't stop thinking about the book. And if there's ever a book I can't stop thinking about, I know it means something. I feel like even in the process of preparing for this video, I thought of new connections and new wells that I could dive down and think a little more deeply about this book, which again makes me feel more favorable to it. As far as the plot goes, my least favorite part was just the whole Mercerism. I just don't feel like it ever fully integrated into the novel for me, especially at the ending when it played such a large role in how things were wrapped up. It was the only thing that, for me, I wasn't as interested in exploring. Now, I do think it's very interesting when you find out it's fake. Like, that element is really great, but seeing Mercer appear to him in that kind of like hazy state, I think there's ways I can connect it in. It just ultimately, I felt made the narrative a little messier than I wish it was. I also thought the love story, quote unquote, between Deckard and Rachel was super undeveloped. Now, I love its conclusion. Like, I love a lot of elements of the romance and like the idea of it I really like. Again, it's the execution of it because Deckard acts like he's in love with Rachel, but I don't understand why. And again, this might just be me. If you guys have followed me for a while, you know I'm weird about romance. I rarely like them, but I just wish like there was a little bit more there to understand their connection in the novel so I could buy into it a little more at the end because that would make it stronger. I just could never quite buy in. That said, there's just so many questions raised about AI and humanity. For example, the whole theme of empathy. Is empathy really the thing that sets humans apart? Can empathy not be synthetically created? One of the best parts, in my opinion, of Rachel in the book is you get pretty attached to her. You're kind of on her side. You think she's a good guy, whatever that means. And then at the end, she shows absolutely no empathy, no remorse, no mercy when you think she's had it. And I think that's a super interesting thing to think about. Because again, I don't think Dick gives you straightforward answers about how you're supposed to feel about that or what it was, but it is definitely wrapped into, did she ever have feelings? Did she ever have empathy? And the whole animal thing, I love. Now, the animal portion is something both movies didn't adapt, and I just wish they had, because I think it's a fascinating element about, is that a good litmus test? Would that be a thing, this whole electric versus real animals? And you have this futility of caring for an electric animal, yet you need the optics of it to prove that you are human and care for them, and how the empathy test also works on basically talking about different animals and how you would respond to seeing them killed. And then the fact that having an electric animal is so important if you can't own a real one, but at the same time, we are saying that the replicants, which are basically essentially the same thing except for humans, like a fake human, is not okay and should be retired immediately. again, just so much to discuss, so much puzzle pieces there. And then there's the constant questioning of who is an AI and who isn't, and how do we discover it, which is really great with the fact that there is this underlying tension and question of, is Deckard a replicant? I love how subtle the author is with that question in the novel, because it is subtle. You pick up on it and you're like, oh, maybe we'll find out Deckard's a replicant. And there's never an answer, and there's never even the question really posed to us. We just kind of have a feeling that it's there and hidden and underlying, and I love how that weaves through the narrative. And that topic felt weirdly prescient in a way, because now we've been doing a lot of questioning of, is this art AI? Is this writing AI? Having to ask that question constantly, is this human or AI? And does it matter? I think like weirdly can be found in this piece, which is something I think is missing from a lot of other AI works. Ultimately, even with the execution issues I talked about, I can completely understand why this story has captured generations and why it remains such a sci-fi mainstay, because I do think it raises a lot of interesting questions that continue to be relevant about artificial intelligence. Now, let's talk about Blade Runner. Released in 1982, Blade Runner is iconic and a staple of pop culture. Its influence on genre and aesthetic is huge, with so many prominent filmmakers today listing it as a formative piece of work. So I hope I don't get canceled when I say this movie was just okay for me. I didn't love it, and the thing is, I went in expecting to love this movie, and instead I felt it was fine. I didn't dislike it, I didn't hate it anyway, it was just fine. I do think an element of my reaction to this movie may be this odd space where I grew up watching movies that were very likely inspired by Blade Runner. Blade Runner changed genre. It inspired so many things. And so sometimes when you grow up watching the things inspired by the original can feel lackluster because you've seen it before, even though the original is the one who did it first. So I do think that colors my experience with Blade Runner a little bit, and I acknowledge that. I knew going into this movie that it would not be a direct adaptation for several reasons. One, I do live in this world, so I knew some things about Blade Runner. I also always think it's a good indication when a movie changes the title of the book that it's not attempting to be a direct adaptation, but mostly just inspired by. And lastly, because I think this book would be pretty weird as an adaptation if you took it at face value. I think there's a lot you would just need to leave out to make it a cohesive narrative, because as I said, the execution was one of my problems. You would need to change things to make that cohesive narrative. So it makes sense that they simplified it a lot, and actually in some ways they used more than I expected, because the main central plot line is very lifted from the novel. I just think I expected them, if they were only going to take one of the main ideas of the novel, to dig deeper, whereas I felt it was a little bit of a shallow representation of the themes. Not always. I just thought it would raise or ask more questions than it ultimately did. I was also surprised at how little personality Deckard had in the film. In the book, I found him to be a little bit unlikable, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a way that Deckard had a clear personality, and I found it a little unlikable, and I think that might have been the point. I've looked at people's reviews of it, and it seems like people agree with me that they often found him off-putting, but that also added an element to the android question and just who he was. In the movie, I expected them actually to make Deckard a lot more likable, like maybe more of an action hero. So I was surprised that instead I felt that Deckard had very little personality. It was kind of like nothing. He was kind of just there as a means for the plot, and I didn't necessarily feel like I knew who Deckard was. Now, this may have been intentional, as the movie also raises the question on whether Deckard is human or android, and perhaps they gave him that kind of personality to lean you towards that maybe he is a replicant. But other replicants in the movie I felt like had more personality, so I'm not sure how intentional or unintentional it is, but it did surprise me. So I really expected the movie to fix my issue with Rachel and Deckard's storyline. If anything, I expected them to make it much more of a love story, and I thought, well, that might work more. So imagine my shock when I actually liked Deckard and Rachel's story less in the movie. Far from fixing it, I think they actually made it worse. Again, the concept I like, but the execution of it. One thing that really surprised me again is that Rachel has way less agency in the Blade Runner movie. In the book, as I explained, she does quite a lot. She is in on the Rosen Corporation's subterfuge. Like, she wants to be a part of it. She has a lot of personality. She's an active participant in all of this. She is the one who kind of seduces or controls the relationship with Deckard and then makes some wild decisions at the end, you know, killing his goat. Like, she is a very active participant, whereas Rachel in the movie feels very passive. And I don't necessarily think that's always a bad choice. I think they were trying to raise questions about how much choice Rachel really had, and questions about what memories are her own, what skills are her own, and what were just put into her mind. And because Rachel didn't know she was a replicant in the movie, the identity crisis she must be having. So again, I don't think the idea of a more passive Rachel is necessarily a bad choice. Ultimately, the execution of it in the movie, it just didn't quite hit with me. And a great example of this is, in my opinion, the very weirdly violent kiss scene between Deckard and Rachel. I just didn't understand its place in the movie at all. It felt so out of character for both of them. I felt pretty uncomfy watching the scene. And I looked up a lot of analysis of this scene. I didn't go into this just blind saying whatever I feel. I think a lot of analysis of the scenes are very interesting, talking about forcing Rachel to choose, forcing to make decisions. I understand that on an intellectual level. I am saying that the scene did not read that way to me when I watched the movie. So again, I didn't really love how Deckard and Rachel's love story played out, especially when we go into the very weird and, in my opinion, atonal ending of Rachel and Deckard riding off into the sunset. Who knows how much time we have anyway? Didn't fit the movie, in my opinion. Now, if you're watching this and you know a lot about Bladerunner, you will now know that I watched the theatrical release, which was purposeful on my part. I wanted to see the theatrical release. I did know that there were multiple versions, and afterwards I looked up the differences between the versions, and it seems, I forget, it's like there's a director's cut and a final cut? I don't know. Whichever one is the definitive one does change the ending and makes it much more ambiguous, makes it more about Deckard's memories, and kind of asking you to question even more if he is a replicant. I watched that scene on YouTube after I finished, or I was preparing for this. Much, much better ending of the movie. Absolutely agree with everyone. It seems the internet also agrees with that. That's the ending. So that ending is better. But when I was watching the theatrical one, I didn't think the happy ending made sense at all. I also guess that final cut takes out Harrison Ford's voiceover, which I also think is a good choice because it just really wasn't needed, in my opinion. I already talked about how great the vibe is of the movie, though. The aesthetics, obviously great. And then, of course, the tears in the rain scene. Incredible scene from beginning to end. That scene was like, oh, this is Do Androids Dream? This is the question. This is the humanity of this story. Just excellent delivery. It said so much, and I think that's what's frustrating about that scene for me, is because it said so much in such a short time that I felt like they could have been doing that a little more throughout the rest of the movie. Anyway, I know that sounds like a lot of complaints. I really didn't hate this movie at all. It was just like thematically overall was a little lackluster for me. Enjoyed the vibes, enjoyed the movie, it was just okay for me. In terms of what it says about AI, I think a lot of it was AI can feel, AI can touch humanity. I think it's a very different flavor than the original novel. And now finally, on to Blade Runner 2049. Released in 2017, this movie was specifically a follow-up to Blade Runner the movie and not an adaptation of Do Androids Dream. And I really liked this movie. I thought it was good. And weirdly enough, even though it is not an adaptation of the book in any way, like none of the events match up, I actually think it was more of a spiritual successor to the book. I think it raised a lot of similar questions, and the vibe of the movie was much closer to the book in that it raises a lot of questions, it gives you a lot of ideas, and doesn't feel the need to answer them for you. It just kind of presents something and wants you as the viewer to kind of deal and reckon with what it presents. And so in that way, it felt a lot more similar to the book. When I was watching it, I was like, Villeneuve clearly has read the book. He just wasn't only inspired by Blade Runner the movie, which I think he has named as a very influential movie for him as a director, but it was like so clear to me that he had read the book and was taking a lot of inspiration from that as well. This one's really interesting as a sequel to Blade Runner because it clearly and specifically centers a known replicant. which I think is a pretty significant change and one that I think works really well in terms of theming. It also gives a larger of a focus to the prejudiced replicant's face. This is something that was seen in shades in the original novel and movie, but in my opinion is brought to the forefront of this film, which honestly makes a lot of sense to me considering the 2017 release date. It brought up a lot of questions. It obviously extended themings around android and human relationships together, but it also extended that by being like, what about android v more android with Ana de Armas, and the idea of compulsion. How much is real with Armas, I think her name is Joy, and how much is fake? How much is real with Joe and how much is created? Where does that line begin and end? And this idea that Armas, as the embodied AI, is the one who tells him that he's special and names him is just a very interesting layer on where humanity begins and ends. And centering Joe as the replicant, where he is kind of playing both sides, is also fascinating in terms of theming. We also have this journey for Gosling in, oh, I am special and I am different, and then, oh, nope, I'm not actually. And because he's our central character and we are viewing him, we're kind of on his side as viewers, that also, begs the question of how we feel about AI and humanity. Like in the movie, he clearly has empathy. We see him have empathy multiple times. And so where is the line between human and AI, and is it just an artificial line that in this movie they have created that really has no meaning, especially if an android had a baby? Just a lot to unpack there. So now we can do a little bit of a comparing between these three pieces of media and the time period they are made in and their relationship to AI. And I think one interesting thing to look at in terms of history is where technology was in each of these decades. So when we look into the 1960s, we see the first robots are being used for industrial purposes and other advances in robotics. We have the space race, we went to the moon, and the first video games were created at the end of the 1960s. And then if we jump into the 1970s, since Bladerunner was created at the very beginning of the 80s, I feel like the 70s technology is probably what influenced it more than 80s. We are seeing the rise in availability of personal computers and the rise of video games and the early stages of the internet. The 1980s are widely considered the first AI boom, where AI began to be widely used. And then we move into the 2010s, where AI is being used to collect data, and we have gone further into machine learning based on neural networks than ever before. AI can be used to create. AI is carried around in everyone's pockets. It's the decade before the next AI boom coming in the 2020s. And I definitely think we see all of this reflected in the individual pieces. The 1960s book seems to have a lot of fear to me. There is a larger focus on the lives of the immigrated in the novel, which is something that is mentioned very much in passing in both movies, but a much bigger deal in the book. Is this related at all to the fear of the expansiveness of going to the moon, of opening space? We're having the first kind of humanoid-looking robots in existence, and robots who are doing tasks that could have maybe been taken by humans. It makes sense to me that someone would want to push what it meant to have these new intelligences mixed among us. Also, there's just such an idea of being left behind in the novel, which makes sense to me as technology was ramping up so incredibly in the 1960s. I think it's significant that this novel is the one that envisions a future that is desolate and lonely rather than overcrowded like the movie counterparts. When we move into Bladerunner, the AIs are more violent. And I'm not saying that they are not violent in the book, because they certainly are. But in the book, there's a lot of time spent on the craftiness of the AI and how they use words and situations to twist things on Deckard and try to fool him. Whereas in the movie, we go pretty much straight to violence every time. Now, this may just be a function of creating a movie adaptation, but since the movie was a little bit slower, like it wasn't something that needed to be fast-paced all the time, I still think this was an intentional decision. The AI in the movie don't act foolproofly human. They're just a little off. Additionally, like I said before, this movie envisions a very crowded and tight future. And then we have this dark aesthetic, this cyberpunk aesthetic, that would go on to be very influential to sci-fi in the 80s, and sci-fi continuing on. And of course, the language of the Tears in the Rain speech itself. I have seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watch sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die. Were these elements reflective of the increasing connectivity of the world? Was this a reflection of the Cold War period of time that is reflected in a lot of 80s sci-fi that is about death and destruction coming at the drop of a hat with little control? And finally, Blade Runner 2049, where we live in a technological landscape that is closer to real AI as imagined in this book than ever before. And as a reflection of that, it also centers the AI as the main character of the story. And in a time period where we've become increasingly aware and concerned with injustices in the world and prejudices, to also amp up the exploration of prejudice against AI. Additionally, whether it was intentional or not, I wonder if our memory maker stating that you can always tell if it's a created false memory versus a real memory is some sort of exploration of these questions we ask on, can you tell if the art is AI art? Can you tell if the art is AI writing? This desire to know that something distinctly human can be recognized, that it cannot be replicated by artificial intelligence. Although admittedly, I don't think other themes of the movie support that reading. Does Armas's character represent a metaphor for our increasing dependence and perhaps obsession or love of the AI we carry with us, something that didn't exist when the previous two pieces of media were created? Ultimately, to me, it seems that the AIs become more human over time, more present as we come closer and closer to the artificial intelligence described in the original novel. Broadly, as we see AI versus human in media in general, it tends to always go to this place of war, of all-out competition. And when I view our conversations about AI today, I don't necessarily think that's changed necessarily, but the form it's taken has. Instead of being worried about our physical existence, we are now more worried about our creative existence, about our intellectual existence. Is AI going to take over the things we love most and be better at the art of creation, something that humans hold really dear and enjoy? Ultimately, in my opinion, the question always comes down to, what is it to be human? And I think that's the question that all of these pieces are trying to answer. So after all that, my ranking. My ranking is, do androids dream of electric sheep first, Blade Runner 2049 second, and Blade Runner third. Again, didn't dislike any of these, but that was my level of enjoyment. I swear I did not go into this thinking that I would be listing the book first. I know you're probably like, Bookborn, you always like the book better. I really didn't think so this time though, because I had heard so much about Blade Runner, and also I have no skin in this game. It's not like I read this book a while ago and became attached to it. I experienced them all in a very short period of time. Ultimately, despite my problems with the book, it just raised the most questions and I am thinking about it the most. So to me, that makes it my favorite piece. But overall, I'm not surprised that this as a property has been such a mainstay, has captured the attentions and hearts of people for so many decades. This was a super fun project that I had a great time with, and I would love to know your thoughts on so many things below. If you've experienced all three pieces of media, rank them for me. Tell me what you think of my ranking. If you cannot believe that I only thought Blade Runner was okay, nicely yell at me in the comments about it. Talk to me about the differences between AI. Talk to me about how you view the book and the two movies as reflective of the time period, anything you have to say to me. And as always, if you like this kind of dissection of media, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.